Welcome back to this week's episode of Green Enterprise, a partnership between my company, Digital Venture Partners, and Black Enterprise Magazine, where every week I have a conversation with a prominent Black executive in the cannabis space that's found success, but more importantly, is figuring out ways for more Black people to come into the space and find a sustained position in our industry. Today I have with me Alex Stone of Stone and the Family Cannabis Company, a gentleman that I was fortunate enough to meet in Las Vegas. Was really impressed by your knowledge, your understanding, and your insight into the space. So I'm excited to have you on today.
Thank you, man. I appreciate the time and the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. So jumping into it, I would love for you to give our viewers an idea of what you did professionally before you jumped into cannabis full time.
Okay, sure. I was kind of a jack of all trades. I'm a college athlete. I played college basketball, and then further, I have a mass communication degree from Xavier University. And then I went into broadcast journalism, odd jobs here and there. And then I went right into trying to be a lawyer. I thought I wanted to be an athletic director in higher education and college athletics. So I said, look, this is the path that I'm going to take. Stumbled into coaching, and I coached for a year in high school, and I had to teach in order to pay bills. And I said, look, this is something that I love to do, but I don't love to teach. I didn't really love being bound by the 6 subjects in high school. So I went into coaching in college, and I coached college basketball at 3 different universities. I was at the University of Notre Dame, Delaware State, and St. Peter's University in Jersey City. And I had a daughter. And when I had my daughter, I kind of had to figure out, what do I want to do full time? Because I also want to have this time with her. All the coaches that I had known really didn't know their kids or had the type of father-son or father-daughter relationship that I wanted to have. So I resigned to stay at home with my daughter, to pull in money. I had a sneaker store at the time in Glen Burnie, Maryland. So I was pushing kicks. And what's funny is I had a pop-up in South Philly over 420 weekend, and it was a 3-day pop-up. I probably sold maybe $7,500 worth of shoes, and I did really well on the cannabis side. So I said, kind of looking at my spreadsheet after and looking at the traffic and getting my newsletter together for everybody who came, I said, man, it's 60-40 and I'm giving the 40 a generous bump. So I said, you know what, cannabis is something that deserves my full-time attention. How do I build something that can scale later, but gives me the opportunity to brand it and take it into different states? And it just kind of went from there. And I've always been, somebody that in the professional world, I leaned on my family dynamics, my structure, my values. Those things kind of drove the car and everything that I did. So I said, look, this has to drive the car in what I do from an entrepreneurial standpoint.
Right. And that kind of leads me into my next question, because we both came into the space from more traditional industries, like most people do. What were some of the differences just trying to navigate that stigma of working in cannabis and honestly having to validate yourself all over again as a Black professional in a space where what we sell or what we operate around is federally illegal?
It was interesting because cannabis in the compliance space back then didn't exist like it does now. It was available, opportunities were available in California and Colorado, and just starting to get there in Oregon. And I'll never forget when we played against the University of Oregon in Eugene, going up there and then seeing, like, having my boss and the other people that I work with, right? They have one depiction of cannabis in office talk, let's say, right? And then it always comes up, like I was coaching in college, you're coaching 17 to 22-year-old guys. Of course, they're smoking weed, hanging out, drinking. So you got guys having to get drug tests, failing piss tests. These were all things that came up, and you start to get people's understanding of cannabis, right? And it has this dark cloud over it. But then, you go to Eugene, and I don't know if you've ever been to Eugene, but it's like the Wild Wild West. Like, there's no rules. Everything is all good. It's hunky-dory. There's hippies everywhere. And I think it really was able to show the people that I work with, this isn't something that is on the corner that there's a guy with a wave cap and a 6X, long tee. It's not like, let's really understand it. And I opened my mind up to, hey, I really have to, if I'm going to educate other people on what this should look like, I should not only know what it looks like, but figure out what it really should look like and be able to connect those dots and draw the distinctions.
Okay.
So that's what, kind of set me on my path. And, that's when the wheels started turning about, hey, maybe cannabis can bring me the same type of lifestyle that I thought basketball was going to bring me.
So when we both were exposed to the industry in a way where it's really intriguing and you realize there's something there. How long did it take for you to get from that point to you forming your current company, Stone in the Family? And kind of what was that process? How intensive was it for you to go from, okay, I have an idea, I see an opportunity, to now you have something finite that you're trying to grow?
It was pretty fast for me because I like to work backwards. Working in higher education, coaching, college athletes, you become very goal oriented, right? But like the traditional sense in being goal oriented, I felt like, in my upbringing, it taught me to have a vision, right? Figure out the long term of like, what does this look like down the road? And then figure out what my pathway is. But I kind of have adopted to trying to figure out what I want to do and then circle back to, all right, well, how do I get there, right? So I was kind of already at all right, well, look, I'm a family guy, I'm having a daughter. I had raised my ex's 2 sons. I was married for 6 years. So family was everything and ingrained in every part of my life. My father played in the NFL. My mom was one of the first Black cheerleaders at Notre Dame. So I come from a culture that tells you there's a very linear way to do this, right? But obviously cannabis doesn't have that same form and structure. So I wanted to impart my version and my way on that. So that's when I said, look, I'm going to create a business that is family centered and it's a conglomerate of brands. So I have my piece, you have your piece, my uncle has his piece, my cousin has his piece. But your uncles, your brothers, your sisters, your cousins are effectively the people you're collaborating with, right? So there are other brands that are ingrained in my family. So then I had to figure out, well, how does that really come out to play in the market? And what is that going to look like? Because these people aren't your family members. So you really have to know who they are, make sure that they're experts in these respective areas, and then make sure that our way of doing things jives, right? There is that sort of family appeal. So that took some time, right? Feeling out all of those intricacies. But the vision was crystal clear from jump. I wanted to have something that was organic, that spread out across the different pieces and parts of the supply chain, because that's when I really started understanding supply chain management and what are the problems with the industry. Because the coach in me wanted to look at the cannabis industry and say, hey, what's the problem? Where can I put my business into the problem and have my business fix something? So I felt like, there were 2 different sides of the street developing. There was, I guess, the legacy side, right? And the corporate side. And those 2 different sides of weed look completely different. And the one that I had the most affinity to, the legacy side, had the most culture, had the most pizzazz. And I felt like there was a way in for me because I'm a creative. So, that was kind of my entry point. And I said, look, let's just develop it over time, because I think sometimes people want to have everything figured out when they go to their respective friends and family to explain it. Right. That's what your family's going to tell you. Oh, well, you didn't think about this, or you don't have this. I kind of wanted to create the shell, figure out where do I want to operate, how do I want to be, how do I want to be seen, and then fill in those other pieces of the puzzle later, because you don't want to make a rush decision. You want to let it ebb and flow and develop into a finished product.
Right, agreed. And that was very similar to how I came into the space. I came into the space wanting to be very brand focused, found my way over to like the content side, right? And that's where I found success. So I want you to speak on like what areas of the supply chain does your company exist in? How have you found success in those particular areas?
Um, so well, let me first start off and say when I first got into it, you're looking at how much money do I need to make? Where do I want to be? How do I want this to look? Um, and you want to get to the source because that's where the bigger price points are, right? So I started in cultivation. Um, and then I started to, because when you're not in these states where they have legal cultivation and you're having to deal with cultivators, it's a very up and down sort of graph, if you will. But then when you take that to the sales side, if your brand is up and down, you're not going to have any consistency. So I figured, how do you get consistency? You have to become more educated on the cultivation side and where this plant is coming from, how it's being harvested. So that's where I put a lot of my sights, right? I spent about a year, just being a sponge. And then I said, all right, well, what does cultivation look like 20 years from now? And I started to see that all of these strains were brands. People just weren't grasping that concept yet. So I said, look, if I can, I'm creative. If I can get myself into the branding space with a cultivator and namely get with a cultivator that's doing his own breeding, our strains are unique to what we have as a business. How do we continue to get consistency in them, push them forward, market them, and then start to get that into different markets because things are illegal federally, bro, you got all these different markets, right? You got some states that are so big, like Cali's so big, you have different markets within the state. So you've got more than 50 markets, right? So it was really interesting to me and exciting when I learned that aspect. So we got into cultivation first, then got into branding and marketing, stretched that into consulting, because when now you might be legal in one state and that lands a little bit better for startups, but then there's another state that's unrolling their process. Well, then people need know-how, they need expertise, and they need brands to come in because most of the markets were medical, transitioning over into recreational. Well, in medical, you can't market, there are no brands. The customer doesn't have any affinity with the labeling and the packaging and all of those things that kind of take over in branding. And in some regards mean more to the customer than the actual product, right? So if you kind of have that understanding and then you marry it with cultivation knowledge and strain expertise and breeding, that's what I felt like spanned over the whole supply chain. Because if you're a cultivator and you're selling to retails or you're working with distributions to get your products in stores, you have to have branding knowledge. You have to know, well, all right, look at the back end of how does it look to a customer? How does it come across? And how does your brand feel? And that's, effectively what people are going to grow to either learn to love or hate and move on to the next brand. And just, the little bit of expertise I had in sneakers and branding with merch and creating different lines and failing. I mean, that's the best education I really ever received was dropping a couple grand on a merch collection and then taking a year to sell it, taking 2 years to sell it, or not selling it and then having to dump and reload. So all of those different things, in my opinion, were what were gonna make sure that Stone and the family touched all these different elements of the supply chain, and that's where I wanted to be. So that's kind of where we started. And that's where we are now, with collaborating with other individuals in states that don't allow you to do that creatively until they do, because laws change when they figure out that they're unfair or that they're not equitable. So just trying to kind of know the long term and what the goal is, and then look at the microcosm of how does the right now look? How can we get established and operate in the right now? And then move that into what do we want to become?
Right. I agree 100%. And you said something that I always tell people, like you figure out the right way by doing it the wrong way, right? And continually just immersing yourself in the industry to figure out the misconceptions you need to change to operate more effectively. So I feel like when Black people come into the space, they come in with a false pretense. Either that someone has sold to them, or just from lack of context they've given themselves, right? So what do you think Black people need to know as they come into this space that maybe you or I didn't know until maybe year 1, 2, or 3? What are some of the misconceptions you had to correct as you went through the space?
The biggest thing I think is like getting out of the my man's mentality, right? Like accepting something as a school of thought or as a way to be just because your friend told you. And a lot of times, you use that term, my man's, you may not even know my man's actual government. Like so you really don't know these people, but it creates that false sense of affinity, right? I think people don't, I mean, we're in a society where people don't read. So people just aren't generally doing research. They're doing Instagram or Google research, right? So I think people really need to understand what these different markets are, how many different ancillary businesses there are in addition to the plant touching businesses. And then if you can understand all of those dynamics, then you can dive in and start going to some of these conferences, listen to people talk, because you may go to a conference and it may all be about cultivation, or it may all be about ancillary businesses when it comes to lighting, nutrients, things that they sell in grow shops, right? But these are areas of the business that don't actually touch the plant, right? So these are all areas of income that you can get into from a corporation standpoint or an entrepreneurial standpoint, and you don't ever have to do anything that is associated with risk or any illegal nature. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions that people don't understand. So then when they come into cannabis, they think the only avenues of entry are cultivation, retail, and or wholesale, right? Or delivery. And it's like, bro, there are so many other aspects that touch this plant that have way less startup costs. The barriers of entry are a lot lower and easier. And if you really look at any of this very successful, or I guess you got to go back to what success means to you. But if you look at anybody who's been able to go from A to B to C, they've pivoted, right? They got in one way, and maybe they grew as a company or changed paths, or those are all things that you have to be knowledgeable about before you start doing your research to understand what you're looking at.
Right. And I would love for you to kind of speak on how you see the New Jersey market developing in particular, because New Jersey has a high concentration of Black people, is
Mm-hmm.
right next door to New York, and is next to these other states such as New York, Pennsylvania, I believe Connecticut, that
Mm-hmm.
are have recently
Maryland's
legalized
right there.
and just trying to figure out, their way. And I tell people that the East Coast is going to be a very consequential region in cannabis over the next however many decades. What have you been following, and what's important for someone in New Jersey or a new state to follow as these things start to roll out?
I mean, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving pieces. The reason why it's such an attractive market is here in New Jersey, we're kind of a throughway, if you will, for so many other states. And especially in like the central Jersey area, I mean, on any given day, you'll see license plates from Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York City, New York State, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, right? It all comes right through there. And then there's also so many other states stretching back to North Carolina, Virginia, that, are all coming through 95, right? So that's why the state is so attractive and this area is so attractive. Now that it's kind of moved over from medical to recreational, they're starting to really realize how many users there are out here and how many different customers there are, right? Not just flower smokers, right? Like you can kind of get a feel for the extract side because New York was flowerless for so long. So you were able to see, hey, there's a market that is able to pull in numbers and scale and do all of those things, and it doesn't even touch the flower. So those products, the way that it's set up looks completely different. That business model is completely different. So there's a lot of interesting opportunity that's here in the tri-state area. I think what people really need to hone in on is are these opportunities going to go to residents and people who look like the diversity that's here in this state? Or does it just look homogenous to what the startup of some of these other markets has looked like? That's why I think there's so many levels of interest here in our state and surrounding states, because people are really eager to see what it looks like. And generally speaking, New Jersey, New York, whatever you want to call it, it's a very corrupt area because there's a lot of money in tax dividends that come to play. So that's why it looks kind of random. The dates have moved and moved and moved and moved. We still haven't been able to submit applications for the first recreational round, but we will soon. So that's coming in December, stretching over into the later months, and I believe it's going to roll. So as education sets in as well, you'll see a lot of different opportunities from the cultivation side, to the retail side, to the delivery side, and also the consumption lounge side. So I think looking at all of those aspects, people are like chomping at the bit. Right after the election, people were able to vote on it. So you were able to go and see from it just being on a ballot to, hey, this is actually in newspapers and it's a concept and we can go after these licenses. I just caution people to, like I said before, just do your research because the state has an agenda too, right? And they want your tax dollars. They don't necessarily want to see you get paid. So I say that to say that people do have to do their due diligence anytime there's a new market and make sure that it's fair, equitable, and balanced.
Right. And this is kind of a complex question and we only have a few minutes. So I don't want to paint you into a corner because it's a complex question. But
I do well.
I want you to speak quickly on the power of collaboration in the application process and how intensive it is, because there's a misconception that, when my state's legalized, that you go down to City Hall with a $2,500 or $5,000 application fee and now you have a license, when in reality, it is in most cases a multi-year process. So how do you put a meaningful application together if you're a Black person in New Jersey or New York?
I think that there are some thought leaders out there that can provide leadership and guidance on the subject, but I wouldn't, like, everybody wants to be first, but I would caution people that trying to make sure you do it right and not just do it first, because I know people in California that have spent over $1 million and still don't have a license. Like it takes that kind of time if you're self-funding, if you're buying your own building, if you're doing a lot of these things yourself. So I think there's a huge power in collaboration. I think you have to figure out, again, what area of the business you want to be in, what you have, right, in the right now. What do I have to lend to this opportunity? And then where the gap is, right? And then I think that there are a lot of institutions and organizations that can provide that fill for that gap that look like us. You just have to do the work and finding the right people. Because what I will caution you on is because this is a business where you go to some of these talks or you read some of this literature and people will tell you that you can make $10 million in a year. Oh, my business is worth 10 million, 20 million. I just got a new valuation and this, that, and the third. And these are usually the people that are kind of false prophets and trying to convince you to jump in blindly. Like I said, there are a lot of vultures. There are a lot of people that are trying to steal thought, trying to take things from the creatives that have built this industry and make it their own, right? That's why you have huge corporations that are usually the ones that can secure licensing first. But the biggest thing in weed is, like, you can get a license. You might be able to even figure out how to get a crop and grow some weed. But what does that weed really look like, right? What does it taste like? What do customers think of it? What type of brand loyalty are you going to have? Those are all things that point back to the legacy market and the way that weed has looked, because it's looked one way, right? Kind of hush, back alley kind of conversations. That comes with a certain type of vernacular, a certain type of behavior, which doesn't exist in corporate America. So now you have these stores that look like the Apple store selling weed, and it's completely different. So I think there's going to be a merging of the two. and people need to understand and figure out where you fit inside that merge, how you want yours to look like, because there's no right way to skin this cat, right? There's a bunch of different ways. It's just a matter of getting it done, and what works for you.
Right. And in closing, before I have you tell us where we can follow you in your company, I want to tell you that I genuinely appreciate this conversation. I was telling you before we hopped on, the thing that struck me about you when we first met in Las Vegas was you told the truth the entire time. I always say, I don't want to be motivated. I don't want to be inspired. Tell me the truth, and I'll use that to motivate myself. So you're one of those people who I got that feeling from. And I think it's important that people like you, as you said, are the resources and the points of reference that Black people use as we come into this industry, because it's already dangerous enough. It's already enough risk for failure. So,
Mhm.
people like yourself should have the opportunity to share your experiences, because all you want to do is give people a realistic outlook on what they can expect. But I would love for you to tell our viewers where they can follow you and your company going into 2022.
So Stone and the Family Canico can be found at Stone the Family Canico on Instagram. My website for consulting and any of those different things are right in the bio. So you can, in 30 seconds, go and follow us, get a quick education on what we do, how we do it, and who we serve. And then all of the other social media handles are right there in the bio. So like I said, man, we're a conglomerate of brands that stretches across the supply chain through our partner Victory Farms and Triumph and Creative. And we hit, all the different points from cultivation to branding to strategy to community engagement, because the biggest thing that we always need to push forward and talk about is this plant is for the people and it's medicine, and it needs to be in the right hands. It's a gift from God that needs to be shepherded properly. So the proceeds and the benefit from that plant make it back to indigenous cultures, people that started, the activism of this plant, and carry it forward to making sure that those benefits are held in love and light.
Hey man, I appreciate you for your time, Alex. I look forward to seeing your all your progress into next year.
Thank you, man. I appreciate you guys, and I look forward to growing and serving with you.